Okay.
All right, good afternoon. It is time for our afternoon session. We're delighted to have you here. And we will be actually virtually streaming this. So everyone wave to your virtual friends. Yay! Isn't that great? And we do have a lot of people throughout the state of California. This is our first year. We've had 30 sites. Can you believe that? Over 500 people virtually are watching. Crazy. Hi, nice to see you, Radha. So today I am very honored. My name is Kathy Wall. I'm the director of the Inclusion Collaborative, and we're honored to have you here after lunch. And we are really excited to have Julie Kurtz. She will be presenting on understanding the impact of trauma on the brain. This is being virtually streamed. So when she said, "Is this virtual?" we said yes, and she thought that meant being at home. So it kind of tells you that our lack of communication here, but luckily we have technology and we're able to overcome. So it's actually what you do when you're working in inclusion. You have to be flexible all the time. So thank you, Julie, for your patience on this. And I'd like to thank our technical people back there who are taking care of us. So we're going to get started. And Julie, are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Okay. If you have questions virtually, you can type them in, and Andrea will be collecting cards, and we will answer questions at the end. Those of you that are in person, there are index cards on the table, and we will collect those and answer questions at the end. So let's go. Thank you for being here.
Hello, everybody. My name is Julie Kurtz, and I'm the regional director with West Ed. I work on two projects, CEPHL, also known as the Teaching Pyramid, and trauma projects within West Ed. And this is the realm of trauma that I'm working on right now, and we are sharing with you a 50-minute highlight of some of the trauma work that is particularly important in the work that you do with young children. Why I want to share this is so important. We have written 21 modules that we are rolling out across the state and now across the country because we're specializing our modules in really telescoping in on providers who work with children 0 to 8 years old. So this is really important to my heart and to my soul. We're currently in contract to write a book for providers as well. The reason why it's so important to me is because of the trauma history that I experienced as a young child. And somehow, miraculously, the universe has given me this opportunity to make a difference for young children in helping you identify some simple strategies you can use. But today what we want to talk about is how trauma, especially early childhood trauma, impacts the brain. So let's get started. More than 1 in 3 women and more than 1 in 4 men in the United States have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. Just recently on the Today Show, Sesame Street was highlighted because they've released some trauma videos, one of which we may watch today if we have time, and trauma videos for young children with Elmo and some of their Muppets. And what they said on the Today Show, Dr. Besser said, up to 50% of the kids in the United States have experienced some form of trauma by the time they're 18. And that is alarming. That is alarming more importantly because of the impact on the brain. But as an early childhood provider, you have the power and an opportunity to build a child's brain and be a resiliency factor in that child's life. A report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds in the U.S. 35% of babies in a relationship with their caregiver has a severed attachment. This is important because when we define what trauma is, we can't really come up with a generic definition because trauma is individual to the person's sensory system. So let me go a little deeper and talk about that, but let me first share with you this slide. Individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And then, as a result, it has adverse effects on that individual's functioning, both mentally, physically, socially, emotionally, or spiritually. So the individual's sensory system determines whether it is a trauma or not. Whether it's a trauma from a medical procedure that happened one time or an ongoing trauma, again, it's defined by the individual's sensory system. Just because you experience trauma does not mean that you will have adverse symptoms or trauma behaviors that are indicative of trauma. And this is really, really important to know. So again, trauma is defined by the effect on an individual's nervous system, not on the intensity of the trauma or the circumstance. Something that is really important in defining that for an individual is a complete loss of control and utter sense of powerlessness. If you feel out of control and powerless, that can really impact your sensory system. The young child, the more likely they are to be overwhelmed by common experiences because they don't have a mature brain yet. Our brain develops all the way up to age 25. You're born with 1 billion neurons, and if you're born with 1 billion neurons floating around in your brain, whose job is it to help those neurons connect? Primarily the adults that are the closest to that child in their life. And so if a child experiences abuse at the hand of their primary caregivers, then perpetually over and over, they lose a sense of control and safety in the world. And because of that, it then causes them to dive into their survival brain and live there day in and day out, preventing the ability to learn and grow and develop and have focal attention and build relationships and enter the next stage of development. So this last bullet is really critical. If you're working with young children, because they felt a sense of being out of control all the time, in the classroom or in the family child care home or in your home or wherever you're working with that child, their deepest need is to feel in control, and they perpetually feel out of control. They replay that traumatic stress because it's stored in their body. And so one of the most important things you can do for a child is to actually create an environment that is safe and predictable. Routine and predictability is one of the greatest elements of safety for a child who might experience trauma. Because the way that trauma impacts some people's sensory system, particularly that of a child who's undeveloped, with 1 billion neurons, you haven't even fully developed your neurons yet. So if you have extensive trauma or any trauma that your sensory system perceives as feeling a loss of control, then what it does is it activates your survival response in your brain. Fight, flight, freeze, or faint, the 4 F's. So these 4 F's are really critical because if you have a history of trauma, you have a tendency to default when you perceive something as dangerous in your environment to one of these as a perpetual pattern. There are some young children in your classroom that fight a lot, that punch, that hit, that kick, that bite. And those are the kids that when their survival part of their brain is kicked in and they're scanning the room and they perceive something as dangerous, like somebody took a toy away from them or a stranger came in the room, they might go into fight mode. Some kids become runners and they try to run away and they try to escape in any way they can. They might be hiding in the corners of the room. They might be trying to shut everything out and escape. They are the kids that might run. And then you have the kids that freeze. They're the ones that are more dissociative, numbing out. Sometimes you'll see this in the extreme form where kids are banging their head on the wall. But then sometimes you'll see it where a child just dissociates in the corner, staring off in space, and doesn't hear your instructions or directions. So shutting down and having limited skills or the ability to respond in daily functioning is what you'll see with these children who have a trauma history. Because rational thought is impossible during a time of trigger. So let's go a little bit deeper and let's look at the brain. Now, this is going to be a little bit lengthy of a discussion, but it's really, really important. Each of you, hopefully, is sitting there right now watching this, and you have a brain in your head. Obviously, we all do. In the womb, the first part of your brain that develops is that bottom part. Your brain develops from the bottom up. So in the womb, the first part that develops is the hindbrain. I want to call it the lizard brain. The lizard brain is the part of our brain that's the most primitive. It's been around the longest, and we share it with all reptiles on the planet. It's the fight, flight, flee, or freeze. Now, you need this part of your brain because if there's an earthquake right now, you're not going to turn to the person sitting in the room next to you and say, hold on a second, I know the ceiling is falling down right now and the windows are breaking, but I just want to talk to you about all of the options and choices that we have in this situation. No, our brains are designed to shut all ability to think, all emotions, and to just generate enough breathing, blood pressure, body temperature, and heart rate to drive our motor regulation to safety. And so in the most extreme situations, like an earthquake, for example, you're just going to shut everything down and just survive. If you get cut off on the freeway, you need this part of your brain. When you don't need it is if you have a history of trauma and you live in this part of your brain in fight, flight, freeze, or flee, or faint, where you're scanning for danger all the time, and you might perceive this silver bottle as a danger because maybe your abuse occurred with something that is similar. Or when food is delivered to the table, there were issues with food. Or a man with a red shirt walks into your room and that triggers you. Or anything that makes you feel out of control. So you'll see the children living in their alarm center if there's a trauma history. As we walk up the staircase of this brain, we get to the middle part of the brain called the limbic brain. We as humans share this with all mammals on the planet. All mammals share this with us. In fact, it's really cool because millions of years ago, we were just Cro-Magnon people. And we were berry pickers, and we didn't have a desire to have attachment and connection. We didn't even have any emotions. We just picked berries and ate them, essentially. So one day, the hypothalamus and the amygdala developed in the brain of these people. And the minute it started developing, could you imagine that Cro-Magnon person turning around and going, gosh, she looks really hot. I think I want to be with her. And if that woman also had developed a hypothalamus and amygdala, then she's going to reciprocate because there'll be a desire for attachment and connection. Then they get together and they have a baby and they have their own little tribe. And then one person in the relationship turns to their partner and says, you've been picking berries all day. You're neglecting me. I feel so frustrated and sad. Why aren't you giving me any attention? And that's that emotional part of our brain. It's filled with emotions. It's emotional situations that happen, and it's also our desire for attachment and connection with others. So we share that with all mammals. But as we walk up to the very top of the brain right here, it's called the prefrontal cortex, the forebrain, the boss, the CEO, the executive center of your brain. That's what sets us apart from all reptiles and all mammals on the planet. It's what makes us human. But the interesting thing is it's not developed. It's got those billion neurons floating around. So your job as an adult caregiver is to help children build a staircase from the very alarm center, emotional center, and the forefront of their brain so they can take some time. When you use this part of your brain, you pause, you say, oh my gosh, I am so agitated right now. My emotions are in the 80 to 100 phase. When I get like that, I often hurt others or property or myself. So I need to step away and I need to calm down. And I need to do some self-regulation strategies because I know when I get calmer, I'll be able to engage my feelings and map out a plan that'll be good for the greater good of all. And so that's what makes us human, but it takes 25 years to develop this prefrontal cortex. And we need good environments and good relationships to do that. So now you can see how trauma would impact that. Because essentially, children who've experienced trauma and perceive it as trauma live in the reptilian part of their brain, dancing with the emotional. So it's emotional reactivity, emotional trigger after trigger, and then reactivity because they can't engage their thinking brain and slow down enough to pause because they're in a state of survival and danger all the time. So I'm going to ask you to watch this. You may or may not hear the sound. If you don't hear the sound, it's okay. I just want you to visually watch it, and then we'll talk about it after. So the sound is insignificant, so don't worry if you can't hear it. It's only about 15 seconds, so watch carefully. So hopefully if you saw that, you're very lucky if you could not hear the sound, because in every training I do, it's terrifying. And the reason I show that video is because essentially what it does is it shows you what it's like for somebody who's experienced trauma to see the world. It is such a beautiful landscape. And if you couldn't hear it, there's this beautiful, peaceful music playing in the background. And that's how most people see the world. If you're driving through that beauty, you're looking around and you're saying to the person who you're driving in the car, it's so beautiful here. And if you have a trauma history, what you're doing is scanning for danger. You're scanning for the scary pop-up clown that's going to destroy your happiness at any moment. And your body revs up and it's prepared for it, living in that hyper-arousal state. And I'll give you a personal example. I'll make myself vulnerable and share this story. When I was in my 20s, I'm 50 now, but when I was in my 20s and I was dating my husband before we married, we were driving up to a wedding and from San Luis Obispo up into the Bay Area, and the car broke down. And I turned to him and I said, "Are you going to hit me?" And he looked at me like I was crazy. And if any of you knew my husband, he's the sweetest, kindest, most gentle soul on the planet. And I'm very blessed. But my trauma trigger in that moment caused me to say that. And so it was like the scary pop-up clown. I just saw danger and harm for myself, because when I was little growing up, that's where a trigger would happen, is my dad would go into these violent rages when something like that would happen. Or it was a very terrifying situation with me and my brothers to be faced with something like that. So for the children in your classroom, they don't even have a mature sensory system, and they're faced with this feeling of terror all the time. So when the primitive parts of your brain perceive danger, they automatically mobilize a strong physiological response. Some of you may ask me, well, how do we know if the child has a trauma history? Well, you don't. And you can use the same strategies for any child that has these types of behavior, whether they have a trauma history or not. You don't need to know. I'm just educating you a little bit on the backdrop in the brain of what's happening for those children in your classroom. So you can see how many neurosynaptic connectors literally happen between birth to 2 years old. Now, I want you to take a look at this slide. I keep turning my head because I'm looking at the time to be mindful of leaving 10 minutes for questions and answers. This is your brain on trauma. The brain scan on the left-hand side is a healthy brain. The brain scan on the right side is an abused brain. Take just a moment to notice what the difference is. Notice that at the very top of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it's weak and less developed than the brain that's healthy on the left. Also notice that there's a disconnection between the lower parts of the brain and the top of the brain where those circles are. Normally, you want neurosynaptic connectors that begin to lead to the prefrontal cortex or the executive functioning, because you want proof that you're able to access focal attention, planning, pausing, putting on the brakes, mapping a plan, abstract thinking, logical reasoning. You don't have a connection. That means that this abused brain, they're living in the reptile and emotional brain, and there's a disconnect. They're unable to access logical thinking or regulation. And so this is what a brain may look like that's been abused. Very minimal neurosynaptic connectors, because if you've experienced abuse and you live in your survival reptile brain all the time, then you can't pay attention. You can't learn. You can't focus. You can't build relationships. All of it's unsafe, and you're generating cortisol in your body all the time, putting yourself into this heightened response, scanning for that scary pop-up clown in the middle of an environment. And teachers often look at the child's behavior and say, it just came out of nowhere. Why are they doing this? It must come from their family. And so you can actually have some things you can do. Toxic stress is what these kids will experience, and learning how to cope with adversity is a part of healthy development. Moderate short-term stress is okay, and the body can handle that. But toxic stress, with inability to relieve the stressful energy out of the body in the absence of a protective adult support, can be very damaging on a child. I'll give you a silly example. When they hunt polar bears to study them, I don't mean hunt. I mean, when the scientists want to study polar bears, they have to hunt them down and shoot them with a tranquilizer from a helicopter. So they're flying in the helicopter, chasing a polar bear, and the polar bear is running with its stress and survival response in a heightened hyper-arousal state. And so then what will happen is they'll shoot it with a tranquilizer, and it will go under while it's in a heightened state of stress. Guess what happens when it wakes up from that tranquilizer? It shakes its body uncontrollably, and then it lets out a huge gasp of air, releasing the toxic stress from its body, and then it's back into a calm state and it moves on. That is a healthy response to a stressful situation. All of us have gone through something similar, and I can remember when there was an earthquake, I went into that heightened state of stress, and then your body is beating out of your chest, and then it takes a while to get back, but then you get back. Children never go back. They never release the stress, so the body keeps score, and it's stored inside of the physiological system like a timestamp in their body, just waiting for triggers to push it, to push the stored memory, and then to relive it and react it out over and over. And it's stored in their bodies. The interesting thing is trauma is stored in your body, not in verbal memory. It's stored in sensorial memory. So when we say to a child, use your words, what's going on? Why did you hit Johnny? Use your words and tell me. They can't use their words if it was a trauma trigger, because the reacting of a trauma through a trigger does not involve words. So we have to teach children other ways to communicate what happened to them, not just with verbal language. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. In the meantime, I'd like you to watch this video out of Harvard. It's maybe 3 minutes, but it talks nicely about toxic stress and how it derails healthy development. And I just want you to know that if you feel it went too fast, you can Google this on YouTube, Harvard's Early Childhood or Center on the Early Childhood Developing Child. And there's lots of videos on trauma and resiliency and toxic stress, and this is just one of them. So hopefully somebody will let me know if they can't hear it, but I'm going to turn the volume up all the way. Whoops, sorry.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress, the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing neurons. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So as you heard from that video, without caring adults to buffer unrelenting stress caused by poverty, historical trauma, neglect, abuse, maternal depression, a one-time trauma, a medical trauma, neglect, all of those experiences can weaken the architecture of the brain. And what it takes is caring, attuned adults to support these children so they can rebuild those neural connections and then begin slowly to feel there's a sense of safety in the world, that it's not all dangerous. So common characteristics of behaviors for infants exposed to trauma, these are just a few. I'm sure you've seen many of them, unsure whether it's trauma or just normal. Children's undeveloped immature brains responding in the world, but difficulty soothing, inconsolable crying, unresponsive to caregivers' attempt to soothe, resistant to touch, difficulty sleeping or night terrors, feeding issues or feeding challenges, a listless and subdued emotional state, a lack of eye contact, low frustration tolerance, and a lack of play. Common characteristics of behaviors for toddlers. You'll see language delays, a behavior that might alternate from one extreme to the other, frequent and intense tantrums or withdrawal. Their play could appear disorganized or erratic. Difficulty with separation and resistance to adults' efforts to soothe and comfort, which makes it the most difficult for a caregiver who's in this field to help when a child rejects them. It is one of the most painful things, and it's very triggering to us when that happens. And these are the types of children that sometimes are the hardest to love because they push us away and reject us so blatantly because a close connection to them represents danger, and they go into survival mode. So the more we're aware of that, the more we can have the wisdom to support the child regardless of the way that their behavior is. We can look past the behavior on the surface to the child behind the behavior. Common characteristics of children who might be exposed to trauma who are preschoolers. Sometimes you'll see a child take on a parentified role where they take care of everybody, tell everybody what to do, boss them around. Sometimes it's insecure attachment. I worked with a foster child as a mental health consultant in a program, and this little guy, he called everybody mommy. Even somebody who walked in the room was mommy, 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 mommy to everybody. There was an indiscriminate attachment connection. Very controlling interactions of others. They could be upset by becoming close to you. You might see hoarding of food or different materials. Difficulty with transitions and change in routine is a very big one. I was observing quietly outdoors at a classroom, and the teachers didn't introduce me. And this little guy came up to me and he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a friend of the teachers. I'm just quietly observing them." And he looked at me and he said, "You see that spider over there? I hope he eats you up and makes you dead and makes you go away." And my first reaction is probably what many of you who work with children are. Oh my gosh, my inside voice was like, "You little brat, what kind of family do you come from that you would speak that way?" Like the inside voice of what really happens inside of us when someone pushes our button. And then I looked past the behavior to the child, and I thought that behavior has meaning. That child is communicating that I'm a danger and representing a danger, and his reptile brain's kicking in, and he's trying to make me go away so he feels safe again. Sometimes you'll see impaired short-term memory or extreme sensitivity to noise or movements or change in the environment. Sometimes they'll misattribute your facial expression or your body language. They did a study where they had typically developing healthy children watch a video of two children jump roping together on the playground. Then they had foster children with a history of abuse and trauma watch the video, and they asked each of them what they saw. And the children who were in the foster care system with a history of trauma looked at the video of the two kids smiling and jump roping together and said something of the sort. I don't remember exactly, but it was something like, "They're in such big trouble. They're in big trouble," or "they hate each other," or "they're not getting along," or something of that sort. They misattribute the facial expressions and the body language because they can't read it. They scan for danger instead. And they might have difficulty with imaginary play or symbolic play and engaged over and over in repetitive play that plays out their internal trauma. So over and over replaying a certain traumatic situation, maybe with dolls or in a family dramatic area, you might see that. So this is important because we're going to think together about the environment and certain triggers that might affect the arousal state of a child. All children, but in particular, children with a trauma history who are hypervigilant, living in the reptile brain, and missed reading cues and seeing the scary pop-up face all the time will be much more sensitive to any of these. And I'm sure you can see the screen, so I won't go through each one. But you might decide one night to change the environment because you think it's really exciting to let the kids come into all these new things. But if there wasn't a heads up, these kids could be more triggered. Another child crying could be triggering. Someone approaching them too quickly. An angry or fearful facial expression. Even if you don't think you have an angry, fearful facial expression, these children are so sensitive, they pick up on your energy. Which brings me to the concept of mirror neurons. One of the most important strategies you can use is paying attention to your own triggers and staying calm. And Martin Luther King and Gandhi exemplified this concept of mirror neurons better than anybody else on the planet. And the reason why they did is they knew that if they matched the oppressor with the same harsh, violent energy, if they get their mirror neurons in their brain to vibrate at the same level as the violent oppressor, you're just going to be like this all the time. So when a child has a trigger, a trauma trigger, and becomes dysregulated, if the adult is dysregulated too, they won't be able to help the child co-regulate and calm. In addition, if the teacher is stressed, you have a lot on your plate, you have too much going on in your life, you have a lot of life stressors, your supervisor just came in and loaded you with a lot of work, and you're a little bit more agitated or short than you would normally be, guess which children are going to experience that with a higher level of intensity than maybe a child who does not have a trauma history. They are going to pick up on it, they're going to be triggered, and they're going to be acting out all over the place, which is going to make it even worse. So the concept of mirror neurons and the teacher being aware of their neurons and staying regulated is so critical. These are simple strategies. Now, I don't want you to leave today. We're at 1:32 right now. I don't want you to leave without hope. Now we kind of reach a place where it's like, oh my God, this is so traumatic and this is hopeless. But it's not. It's easier to build the brain of a young child than repair the brain of an adult. Now, still don't get hopeless because we all have the ability to map new neurosynaptic connectors in our brain, but we're focusing today on children and young children. So this is another way of looking at it. 1,000 neurons per second are developing in an infant. The brain is plastic through our life, and our mental structures in our brain are always open to change because of the term neuroplasticity. So the healing of a brain that's on trauma, can be induced. Healing can be induced through consistent, attuned communication within the context of important relationships. So let's watch this video on neuroplasticity so you can see how powerful of a role that you have. More important than, I don't want to say, baseball players or actors, because my brother was a baseball player, my other brother's an actor. But, so I can say it, I feel like I can say it, but you're brain builders. You're building a staircase from the reptile brain to the emotional brain to the executive functioning through your relationships that you build with these kids. So there's so much hope. And let's take a look at this very short, probably 3-minute video on neuroplasticity.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, and it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true.
Okay, so you guys aren't seeing the video. Okay.
Throughout our lives.
So I'm not sure why. I hesitate, Kathy, to can you hear it?
We can hear it, we just can't see it.
Okay, I'm going to continue to play it, and the reason why is because essentially you're just seeing a maze with like a fake brain cartoon, and it's really not that important, the visual, so let's listen to it. Thank you for letting me know, though. I hesitate to go out of Zoom and pull up because then I might lose all of you. So let's just listen to it. It's only 3 minutes. It's the words that are more important in this video.
Oh, now we see it.
Oh, not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, and it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It's adaptable, like plastic, and neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-traveled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. we start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
I'm going to go back, not show the video, just to this slide for now. I see that I misspelled neuroplasticity at the top, so that's interesting. What I want to say is that the reason it's easier to change the brain of a young child is because their neurosynaptic connectors are growing the most between 0 and 6. But what most of us tend to do is get so busy when we're working with children on all the tasks, living in the future about what we need to do, worried about meeting this deadline, and not really attuning to the children until there's a fire that goes off. Then we cast the spotlight of our attention over to that crisis and put out that fire, and that crisis and put out that fire. And oh my God, he hit her, let me go run over there. And then we create an environment where we only attune to the children and teach them when something bad happens. And what neuroplasticity is talking about is what it takes to build a new connector from one neuron to the next. And then you develop a neurosynaptic connector that then goes into your brain and equates as a habit. So the way to build children's brains so that the brain becomes integrated is to practice over and over and over certain strategies that you want them to learn. So we'll talk a little bit about that. This is a little more on common behaviors of children in fight mode or flight mode. And fight mode, you know what fight looks like. Those are the kids that are the hardest sometimes to work with. And flight, it's the running. But when we get to freeze, sometimes we ignore these kids because they're not very difficult. You may not be able to see all of the slide. I see some of it maybe cut off, but it's the lethargy, the spaced out, not paying attention, withdrawal socially, not able to vocalize, or daydreaming, unresponsive to our request or command. So now I want to start to think about some strategies that might work for children. A children's regulatory system is immature. It hasn't been on the planet long enough to be able to regulate when things happen around them. Some kids are wired with a more sensitive sensory system. And then if you've experienced trauma and that disrupted your sensory system and that you don't feel safe in the world and you're living in your reptile brain, certain things are going to help in your classroom or in your environments that you work with children to calm a regulatory system when it becomes hyper-aroused. Actually, hyper-arousal we all experience. When we get dysregulated or overwhelmed or overstimulated, we do certain things, hopefully healthy, to calm our sensory systems down. But when you look at the environments that you work in for children, sometimes visually, dimming the lights or reducing the clutter on the walls, providing some safe spaces where children can hide and still be supervised, or calming corners, or safe spaces where they can get away, where one can get away. Tactile strategies. Some kids love to be swaddled or their back rubbed or provide textured blankets or sensory tables. The tactile stimulation calms their sensory system. For some children, auditory sounds can either hyper-arouse or hypo-arouse or bring you back into the perfect state of arousal, which is just that calm state, if you eliminate high-frequency sounds. But for some kids, humming and singing to them, or the female voices in a calm tone support relaxation, instrumental music, white noise, nature sounds, all of those things auditorily could calm some children's sensory systems. Then we get to vestibular, rocking, swinging, bouncing, swaying, pushing of a wall. Do you have those opportunities in all of these areas? And then the natural environment. Taking the child outside and looking and walking with them. could be healing, rich sensory input, loose parts. I love that book, Loose Parts. All of those things could be calming, and those are simple things in your environment. If you actually scan your environment, you think about where you have each of these, so that the child who needs it will access the strategy that works for them. So let's talk a little bit about attunement and connection. This is actually really hard because attachment plays a central role in how children cope with trauma. Now, when we're talking about secure attachment, we know that these kids sometimes are the hardest to feel connected to. They're the most disorganized. They push you away because connection does not feel safe. That's what makes this so hard, is the attachment and connection is difficult for a child. They push you away. They reject you. Here's what happens for a child with a history of trauma. There's a great book called The Body Keeps Score by Dr. Van der Kolk. And he talks about what I said a little bit earlier, is that in your physiological system, when you experience a trauma, it timestamps and stores in your body through the release of chemical hormones where you never got to escape and you felt a utter sense of loss of control. It's stored in your body non-verbally, but it's stored in pieces. So that's why talk therapy often doesn't work with trauma, because you can't pull the story of your trauma out because it's not stored in your body with an explicit memory that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Instead, it's stored implicitly in pieces that are sensorial. So when you're triggered, you could be triggered by an adult trying to get close to you. That adult might say, oh, this child has a trauma history. They have poor attachments and connections. I'm going to do everything I can to build a connection with that child. So the closer you get, the more it triggers the child into the reptile brain, where the child might say, danger, somebody's trying to get close to me. That represents abuse or trauma. I need to up the temperature in the room to push them away because it doesn't feel safe. Now, this is a very, very oxymoron, is that you are trying to build a connection because you learned that in my 1-hour training, but the child is going to push you away. It's going to take a lot of wisdom and a lot more work to that child feel safe enough to build that connection with you, because here's what happens in the middle of a trauma trigger. Let's say a man with a red shirt walks into your classroom, and a man with a red shirt sexually molested that child. The child gets triggered, and the teacher's mind, it's like, why is this child out of nowhere hitting other kids and knocking everything over and trying to scream and run and get out of the room? Teacher doesn't see the red shirt. That's like the scenery of the video. Doesn't see it as danger. Here's what happens to a child when they're triggered, whether we know what the trigger in the classroom is or not, or in the home environment or any environment. The trigger happens, and the child essentially goes out of their mind and out of their body. They leave the present moment, and they get transported back to their past. And then they respond as if the past was being relived at the present moment. And so they don't respond accurately to the present moment. Oh, it's a man with a red shirt. That's just a random person, not a danger. Instead, they're triggered. When you get triggered with a trauma trigger, you get transported back in time, and you respond to the past, not the present. So you can use your relationship that you're developing with the child to bring the child back online by bringing them back into the present moment. So something I might do to bring the child back into the present moment, depending on the child, you have to know the child well enough to know what they can tolerate. But it might be saying to the child, let's use the example of an ambulance goes by, and the child gets triggered because maybe there was an ambulance that caused that trauma involved. So when an ambulance goes by your environment that you're working with a child, and the child gets dysregulated and triggered, if it's a trauma trigger, they get transported back in time out of the present moment, back into another time, out of their body, out of their mind, and they're out of control, almost like a tent that lost its stakes and a big wind came in and they're blowing all over your classroom, out of control, not grounded. And so essentially what you can do is say to the child, I'm pretending I'm talking to the child, I should just be looking at the screen, but I think what's happening right now is you're scared. And I think you might be scared because you heard the ambulance. And I want you to know the ambulance is going somewhere else. They're not coming here. And if you look around, you're safe. You're here with me in the present moment. There's nothing dangerous around. I'm here with you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to protect you. Nothing dangerous is going to happen now. You're trying to bring the child back into their body, into the present moment. Now, that's an example of using your relationship. An example of using a strategy in the environment might mean if you actually proactively created a calming space and taught the children how to use it, they might naturally go to that space to regulate themselves, or the teacher might go with them and say, let's go to the calming space and use the water sensory table, or let's crumple up pieces of paper and throw them in the trash can, or let's go for a walk outside. And the teacher is essentially trying to bring the child back into their body, into the present moment, into a more calming, regulated state. And sometimes that happens through using strategies in the environment where they can expel the energy like a polar bear. And sometimes it might happen through the teacher's relationship. Sometimes it might happen from you holding them and rocking them and humming to them, all of those strategies we talked about. And sometimes the child's just going to draw a picture. But usually what you don't want to do is tell me with words what's happening, because the memory was stored sensorially, and so the child has to communicate it back in a nonverbal way. And what we're doing right now with our trauma modules and the book that we're writing, and I'm working on developing an app with an app developer where teachers will have instant access to some strategies where there would be a way for children to communicate what's happening in their body sensorially versus verbal. For example, it might be a silhouette of a body with a library of visual images where the child can choose maybe, let's say, for example, a volcano. And a volcano could be dormant or simmering or exploding. Or a dinosaur or a sloth might describe the different energy levels they feel. So they can tell you what they're experiencing without using words. So these are important key elements and I'm going to recap. There's some books and some websites, and I'm also going to give you an app, and then I'm going to recap what the key strategies were, and then we're going to open it to questions and answers in a few minutes. So note there are some great books here. In particular, I would recommend Trauma Through a Child's Eyes, Dr. Peter Levine. I would also recommend Dr. Daniel Siegel's Whole Brain Child. And then Barbara Sorrell's Reaching and Teaching Children Exposed to Trauma are 3 great books. I also gave you some great websites. However, there's an app that I don't have on here, and I apologize. And the app is called Stop, Breathe, and Think for Children. So Stop, Breathe, and Think. And there's an adult version and a child's version. And they can check in without using words. And there's also an app called Settle Your Glitter. And it's a way for children to shake the app, and it shows a globe with glitter. We can teach children that sometimes your emotions are swirling. And actually the breath is the remote control for self-regulation. So if we proactively teach children breathing strategies, and Sesame Street has a great video, Elmo, teaching children how to use belly breath, then children can access their breath to calm down. Because when you breathe out, you're putting the accelerator on in your sensory system. And when you breathe in, you are actually putting the brakes on. So when we get overly stressed or triggered, we breathe rapidly, and that's what causes us to dysregulate. So this app on Settle Your Glitter can help children breathe because it has this little sea anemone that has the children breathe with them. So those are some tools that you might use. So let me recap it in the 1 minute that I have, and so we can open it up to you guys asking questions. Remember, your relationship with the child is going to take long to build. It's going to take time. It's going to be painfully slow. If they push you away, look behind the behavior to the child that needs their brain to be developed. And it will take time, and find unique strategies at the point of entry to build that relationship with a child. The second thing is we reviewed some slides that you can look at later on the environmental strategies that you can do to calm the sensory system. And then finally, the last thing that we talked about is how children are transported out of their bodies, out of their mind, out of the present moment when they're triggered. Bringing them back into their bodies, into the present moment, into a calming state before you think of solutions is critical. And sometimes, because those memories are not stored verbally, we can't just use the strategy of use your words. And by all means, we can't just punish, because that's not going to help them build a staircase in their brain. We need to think of ways for them to expel the energy like a polar bear, calm their sensory system through the things in the environment, and come back online so that they can be present again to finish the day in the class. And lastly, I'll just say, I didn't mention this, but minimizing transitions and change, and having routines and structure create safety for children, routines and predictability. So now, Kathy, it's 1:50. I'm going to open it up to questions and answers. Maybe you can guide me through that, or you said someone else was going to.
All right. Thank you very much, Julie. We are excited, and I'm going to walk over and get a question. We have a question from a participant. You reframe classroom clutter. You reference classroom clutter. I should probably get my readers on. There are elementary programs where teachers have massive clutter on walls and hanging from the ceilings. Any comments about that?
Yes, that's such a wonderful question. Thank you for being brave to ask the question during a virtual seminar. I want to share with you that it is sometimes, I want to reframe sometimes why teachers do that. They're very passionate and very excited about so many things. And sometimes that teacher's internal sensory system doesn't get regulated by that. And you know what? Each one of us who are caregivers of children have superpowers and kryptonite, just like Superman. And some teachers don't have sensitive sensory systems, so their kryptonite is they don't see how that might impact children who have sensitive sensory systems. And so they're creating more and more stimulus because that's what they love. And so we need strong teaching teams that can work together to pause and reflect on things like the environment and how it might work for some children, but maybe not others. So I am a big believer in decluttering because I don't think our brains are mature between 0 and 6. And we're not designed to live in the modern world. And the modern world, our brain used, back in the tribal villages, we had 4 adults to every child. We lived in multifamily homes. Now, forgive me, but we have 1 in 4, 1 in 8, 1 in 20, 1 in 30 child ratio. Child's brain is not designed to live in this modern world. So we have to do things like declutter so that we can create calming, because we can't do it always through an adult if their ratios are like that. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Anything virtually? Okay. Well, should we all say thank you to Julie? Thank you, Julie. There's her
Thank you, guys.
Her email is there, jkurtz@wested.org. Ooh, I like that picture. That's calming for me. So thank you for being here, Julie. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Everyone say goodbye.
Email
to
me
our
if you have
virtual.
questions.
And if you have questions, you can email her. Perfect. All right. Thank you very much.
You,
We're going to
everybody.
move and have
Bye.
a break and be back at 2:15 for our next session. Thank you.